Our next speaker will be Hilmar Klinkott, who is professor of ancient history and history of the Near East at the University of Kiel. He wrote his PhD thesis, which was published in 2005 with the title Der Satrap, ein achaemenidischer Amtsträger und seine Handlungsspielräume. And after his habilitation in ancient history at the University of Tübingen, he was finally appointed as full professor at the Institute for Klassische Altertumskunde of the University of Kiel. Now, in Kiel, Hilmar continues to focus on the history of the ancient Near East and the Achaemenid Empire. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Hilmar.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for this nice introduction. And of course, I have to thank the organizers of this wonderful and inspiring conference, Rahim and Robert, of course, and Marissa Stevens and Lexi Hennings. It is a pleasure to be here once again. Ladies and gentlemen, by the conquest of Cyrus II, Asia Minor became part of the new Persian Empire. In consequence, all former local Anatolian polities fell under rule and control of the Persian Great King. From now on, a process of transformation started integrating all these entities, different in political structure, economic condition, and cultural character, into a stable structure of the new common empire. In contrary to the Lydian kingdom, smaller regions as Caria and Lycia are striking examples for illustrating the dynamics of change because the tradition of a dominant political past are missing. Christian Marek so rightly stated, quote, Caria and Lycia are among the most heavily researched ancient areas of Asia Minor in general, but we know next to nothing about them from the Dark Ages to the middle of the first millennium. So the Carians in Caria are quite difficult to identify in the 7th and 6th century BC, in particular because its mention in the Iliad is quite inconcrete. While Carian inscriptions and writing cannot be proved for this time in Caria, many texts are known from Saitic Egypt, as Alexander Schitze certainly will show tomorrow in his paper. Carians as mercenaries and specialized craftsmen were in demand in late period Egypt, Israel, and in Mesopotamia, as Robert Rollinger and Daniel Potts pointed out. In contrary, the expression of cultural and political identity, or as I learned yesterday, the better word would be groupness, in Caria of the 7th and 6th century remains unclear. Daniela Piras convincingly showed that the most artifacts with Carian writing from Caria date from the last quarter of the 6th century and the early 5th century. However, the main source for the early Carian history is once more the report of Herodotus. But even Herodotus emphasizes the close relationship of Carians and Lydians. Therefore, Christopher Rattay stated a kind of cultural intermingling, which he illustrates by archaeological studies on the architecture of rural settlements and tumuli tombs in the Carian Mosinos Valley in the late 7th and 6th century BC. Nevertheless, the scholars try to define autochthonous, typical Carian elements in archaeological findings based on Herodotus' description of Carian antiquities. So the archaic compound settlements known from the late 7th century until Roman time are usually entitled as Lelegian characteristics. But the precise attribution to this particular ethnic group in distinction to the Carioi is at the end hypothetical and cannot be proved by certain textual sources. In particular, the definition of Hydai and Pedasa as Lelegian settlements, even the term of Lelegian masonry, is a hypothetical construction based on Herodotus. He mentioned both Carian places, but without specific ethnic opposition. Therefore, Raymond Descartes identified the Lelegians as an intellectual construction which Alain Bresson described as part of a common topoi on the own Carian past. According to Herodotus, Harbacchus, the general of Cyrus II, conquered Ionia, then started a campaign against the Carians, Caunians, and Lycians in the context of the Persian invasion in 546 BC. So Herodotus reports that the Carians submitted to Harpagus without resistance. And Caria so became part of the Persian Empire. All the more it is remarkable that the Carians are mentioned as Karka in the lists of peoples, the Dahiava lists of the Achaemenid royal inscription, and illustrated in the throne bureau relief at the tomb of Darius I, identified by the attached inscription Darius Naxxurustam E30. Indeed, the reasons for the specific nomination of the small region Caria in these illustrations of the empire are still unclear. Nevertheless, the fact is an important indicator for the Achaemenid idea of status local entities possessed in the conceptual understanding of the empire. This idea is strikingly expressed by the symbolic illustration on Darius' tomb at Naxxi-Rustam. It is the plurality of the peoples which defines the empire, the kshatra of the old Persian texts, which illustrate the unified totality in a programmatic form, and thus, in the proper sense of the word, carries the great king in his legitimized position. This plurality is phrased by the ethnic names in the Dahiava lists, as well as in the pictorial representations of the peoples by their costumes, as illustrated on the reliefs of the throne and tribute bureau at the Achaemenid palaces and tombs. Against the background of this imperial concept and the Achaemenid claim to universal rule, the consideration of the philosopher Charles Taylor on multiculturalism and recognition are groundbreaking. He states that, quotation, the universal demand powers an acknowledgement of specificity. In fact, the political frame of the Achaemenid Empire, structured by the specific ideology of illustrating the complex unity by its pluralistic particulars, required to shape the cultural and ethnic differences and to make visible the relation of identity and otherness. Therefore, Charles Taylor emphasizes, quotation, in the case of the politics of difference, we might also say that a universal potential is at its basis the potential for forming and defining one's own identity as an individual and also as a culture, end of quotation. So, the Achaemenids described the political identity of the empire by the technical term kshatra, but did not denote it by a general overarching name. Instead, the great king expected the distinctive phrasing of its single representatives for visualizing the plurality, and this is, in my opinion, in the sense of Aleida Assmann, shaping the imperial unity to say the local identity. And so, Elspeth Stasenberry also stated, indeed, the great variety of costumes and offerings displayed the central authority may not only have delighted in the diversity of the empire, but even have encouraged it. Indeed, beyond the questions of order, concept, and individual identification, all Achaemenid illustrations of peoples are common in two basic aspects. Firstly, all illustrated peoples or ethnic members differ from one another. And secondly, their differentiation is expressed by material characteristics of the costumes and products. These specifics are so typical that the individual illustration can clearly be connected with an ethnic term, so that accompanying inscriptions are necessary in only few cases, as the Darius Naxxi-Rustam E inscription shows and an other inscription of Artaxerxes III from Persepolis. Vice versa, the concept of royal representation created an atmosphere of expectations towards the members of the Achaemenid Empire to define, phrase, and visualize their own identity. Or, to put it in another way, the idea of the Achaemenid Empire caused a pressure of expectations that the recognition of local identities and peculiarities was only granted by the central power in reaction to a clearly cultural distinction. In consequence, all entities in the Achaemenid Empire are faced with the question how to explain and express their own identity. This royal stance in the mutual local relationship dynamically triggered the necessity of self-perception, of local self-perception, the extroverted self-definition and distinctness from one another. In addition to the establishment of the Achaemenid Empire, guaranteed a structure which offered stable conditions for the development of local culture and politics. It was an area which offered legal, political, and administrative security concerning the payment of regular and fixed taxes, the legal position towards the great king, and the military protection. This security caused political and economic stability and, in consequence, also economic growth. Of course, local prosperity is a basic reason for the development of representative art and architecture, which seems to be additionally triggered by the expectations of the center. Against this background, the development of cultural and political identity in Caria, and in particular under the Achaemenid rule, seems to be paradigmatic. Under the Lydian domination, the role, status, and organization of Caria are obscure. First information only occur since the Persian conquest. Besides the question of historicity, indeed, in the detail of Herodotus' report, the participation of Artemisia as Carian dynasty of Halicarnassus on Xerxes' campaign to Greece is significant. It informs for the first time on the existence of a local dynasty system and its incorporation in the imperial administrative and military structure. Artemisia's grandson, Lycurgus, son of Pisindelis, seems to be the first dynast of Halicarnassus who left inscriptions naming his position. Inner struggles, as the revolts against Lycurgus, illuminate the political formation processes in Caria, affecting the position and status of the dynasts, including a further trans-regional political organization. So, after the murder of Lycurgus in the mid of the 5th century BC, exactly since 454 BC, Halicarnassus, as well as Pidasa, Miletus, Myndus, Carianda, and Neapolis entered the Athenian League, as its tribute lists clearly show. This dynamic process of political positioning in Caria and in its orientation between the Greek world and the Achaemenid Empire culminated when the Achaemenids took the claim to power in Halicarnassus. Or, to put it in another way, Caria was faced to the necessity to mark out their own identity in distinction to both the Persian Empire and the Greek world. So it doesn't wonder that Herodotus included an excursus into his report of the Persian conquest of Caria, explaining the mythic ethnogenesis and several inventions characterizing the Carians for the Greeks: crests on the helmets, devices on the shields, and grips for the shields. Maybe Herodotus reflected thereby a Carian need to explain the own mythic prehistory, also documented, for example, by the Great Verse inscription found 2014 at the Proto-Mausoleum at Mylasa. Supposedly the tomb of Hekatomnos, the father of Mausolus. The fragmentary inscription composed by a certain Hysaldamus, published by Christian Marek and Emanuel Zing in 2018, is a dynastic aretology which explains the Hekatomnid claim to royal power in Caria. In style and genre, the text is comparable to the large aretological inscription of the Lycian dynasty Arbinas from the Litoon of Xanthos, in particular by its character of local self-definition and in its chronological setting of the 4th century. Against this background, the dating of the Hysaldamus inscription in the time when the Hekatomnids established themselves as rulers, kings, and satraps in Caria is highly probable. Obviously, in the context of and in reaction to the so-called satraps' revolt in the 360s BC, Caria succeeded to have been split from the control of the Lydian satrap and was established as an individual administrative unit. The Hecatomnids, probably already Hekatomnos, but certainly his son Mausolus, were appointed satraps besides and in addition to their local positions as dynasts and kings, maybe having a predecessor of the Hellenistic Carian League. The new quality of self-perception pushed the cultural and political representation, visible, for example, in the dynastic monument of the Achaemenids found in Iasos. The fragmentary epigrammatic inscription of one of its statue bases explicitly names the Basileis, obviously the Achaemenid Carian kings. Without recapitulating the history of the Achaemenid dynasty in detail, the new elements are worth emphasizing. Since the 4th century BC, the Achaemenids as dynasts of Halicarnassus are also officially entitled in inscriptions as kings of the Carians, the Basileis ton Charon. In contrary to the mentions of the Athenian tribute lists, which list single Carian cities but not entire Caria as member of the Athenian League, the Achaemenid inscriptions illustrate an understanding of Caria as political entity. Besides the local status as dynast of Halicarnassus, Hekatomnos, Mausolus, Pixodoros, and even Ada were kings, respectively queen, of the Carians, ton Charon. As a further third status, referring to the Achaemenid domination and reflecting the relation to the great king, the Achaemenids bear the title satraps of Caria or of Caria and Lycia. Overall, both titles, the king of the Carians and the satrap of Caria, illustrated the results of a dynamic process shaping a common political identity of all Carians. This new encompassing Carian identity as political unit triggered also new forms of cultural visualization seen in the early pre-Hellenistic style of Achaemenid art and architecture, as demonstrated by the proto-mausoleum at Mylasa, or by the great building program of Mausolus, including the palace, the royal palace, the mausoleum itself, and the Myndostor of Halicarnassus, or the fortification walls. As part of the same process, Mausolus also introduced the Carian royal dynastic coinage, continued in style by his satrapal successors, Idriois, Pixodoros, and Orontobates, which combines local, so to say, dynastic motifs, as for example the Zeus Labrandois, with Persian one, as for example the Archer or the Star, and so to say Greek elements of a proto-Hellenistic portrait style. In Lycia, the politics and cultural development is comparable under a structural perspective. The first indications of social stratification in Lycia are given by the grave monuments, while the tumuli, quite similar to the Carian, are the dominant grave form in the 7th century BC. The stone pillar tombs occur since the late 6th century BC as a specific Lycian type. And comparable to Caria and the Lelegians in Lycia too, the Thermalae, also mentioned in Persepolis' archive as Tomilia, are explained as another, maybe the indigenous group of inhabitants in Lycia. Interpreted as a local dynastic grave form, the pillar tombs represent the importance of the buried by reliefs which adopt and combine Greek and Achaemenid elements. Significant is the famous Harpis monument at Xanthos, a dynastic stone pillar tomb of the first half of the 5th century BC, Catherine Dracot attributed to Kubernis, who accompanied Xerxes with a Lycian contingent to Greece. This specific mixture of Greek and Achaemenid influence, creating another type, typical Lycian style, is continued when in the middle of the 5th century BC a new representative grave form appeared. The stone house graves imitating wooden construction techniques. Especially the frieze of the house grave G at Xanthos, showing a procession of horses and riders and carriages, combines a stylistic element of Greek and Achaemenid sculpture as known from the Epadana at Persepolis. This parallel seems to give a set of relief plates, maybe orthostate blocks, found at the southeastern slope of Xanthos, directly in front of the polygonal fortification wall, showing a lion and a bull. Obviously, they belong to a large building program attributed to the dynast Cuprili designing or redesigning the architectural structure of the Xanthian acropole. In fact, since the late 6th and 5th century BC, in the rural area of Lycia, we find settlements on hilltops, as for example at Chrysa, Tiberisos, Phalos, to Inda, or on the Afshar Tepesi and near Hauran, with fortification walls, often in characteristic polygonal masonry, and with built Lycian agoras. Although Lycia had the status of a semi-autonomous country after the Persian conquest of the just mentioned Harpagos, the country probably was subordinated to the authority of the Lydian satrap in theory. With the development of large rural estates, Lycian inscriptions appear since about 500 BC. Especially since 400 BC, Lycian tomb inscriptions inform on the social structure of family members and estate households. In the early 5th century, local coinage is minted and containing the names of dynasts and settlements in Lycian writing. Mainly these inscriptions and coins inform us about the Lycian dynast system, in which several dynasts were, so to say, Persianized names with Iranian language roots, as for example Atumbara as Atumbares, Mitrapata, Hapaku as Harpagos, Asa, Ashama, Magabata, or Vistaspa. But it is exactly this context for which Frank Kolb stated that the so-called typical Lycian culture features appear in the Lycian core regions of the Xanthos Valley since the 4th century BC in the North Lycian Elmale Plain and Kabalis, in the western hinterland of the Gulf of Telmessos, and in the eastern Lycian mountain areas. This dynamic formation process defining the own local and Lycian identity is phrased, similar to Caria, by scripts on the mythical history of the country as known by the fragmentary Lyciaca of Menecrates from Xanthos in the 4th century BC. The Lycian pillar inscription of Xanthos, probably from the late 4th century BC, commemorates the mythical and historical past of the Carica dynasty of Xanthos, beginning with the deeds of Gergis, son of Harpagos, may be also mentioned in Herodotus, the 7th book, 82, participating also at the campaign of Xerxes and ending with the res gestae of Cheriga. In 1985, Clarice Herenschmidt pointed out the relation of the poem of Symmachus on the Lycian dynast Arbinas to the Achaemenid inscriptions, in particular the res gestae of Darius at Byzantium. And in a similar way, the great relief frieze of the Heroon of Chrysa, also dated to the early 4th century BC, represents the mythical and historical past of the local dynastic family. Examples like the Heroon of Chrysa illustrate the so-called acculturation of Greek and Achaemenid elements in art and architecture. It is part of a process creating an own Lycian style which defines the dynasts by their orientation oscillating between the major cultural and political entities, the Greek world and the Achaemenid Empire. So, for the second half of the 5th century BC, Lycian cities as Telmessos, Telantros, and Crya are mentioned in the Athenian tribute lists when Cherai, the pro-Persian dynasty of Xanthos, defeated Vaxeptimi, the so-called pro-Athenian dynasty of Chlos and Patara. These inner Lycian dynastic conflicts, which last very long, postulated the definition and positioning between the main political spheres, as curiously illustrated by a coin of the Xanthian dynasty Dedenevele, showing a head in Persian style on the avars and a Greek helmet head on the reverse. Comparable to Caria, the formation of political identity also took place in Lycia, characterized by the inner fights in which the Xanthian dynasts claimed the position of Basileia, as the pillar inscription clearly says. In the early 4th century, this Xanthian claim to kingship is questioned by the expansion of Pericles, the dynasty of Limera. He obviously ousted the Xanthian rule in the central Lycia and invaded into the Elmale plain in northern Lycia and Miluas. In the Greek dedication inscription to Zeus of Limera, Pericles entitles himself as Lycias Basileion, who ruled Lycia as king. And Theopompos also reports that Lycians fought successfully against Telmessos under their king Basileus Pericles. Pericles' victory over the Xanthian dynast Atumbara, mentioned in the Tibusilis tomb inscription, caused Artavradades, the satrap of Lydia and Ionia, to stop the dynastic ambitions of Pericles. The latter has threatened Xanthos as the Persian center of political and economic control in Lycia, and thus was involved in the early revolts in Asia Minor of the 360s BC. In consequence of these revolts, Mausolus was installed as satrap, got the permission to incorporate Lycia into the administrative responsibility after the elimination of Pericles, and constantly put Lycia under the Achaemenid satrapal control. Nevertheless, the trilingual inscription of Xanthos proves the still lasting dynamic power of the local autonomy against or besides the control of the Carian satraps, in this case of Pixodoros. According to the examples of Caria and Lycia, it is my hypothesis that the adaptation of Greek and Achaemenid elements and its so-called acculturation processes are not a sign of political position on the one or the other side. Instead, the cultural mixture illustrates a creative formation process to form and phrase the own peculiarities, so to say, the local identity and position in the multi-ethnic Achaemenid Empire. Therefore, the adaptation of Achaemenid forms and style elements is not intended as a part of an official imperial cultural policy, but depends from the political, social, and administrative conditions in the empire. The various intensity in adapting Greek or Near Eastern motifs are best explained by different aspects of identity, for example, on local or regional levels or in contact with the imperial court society. In my opinion, the differences might also reflect the process of experimentation, using the actual offer of forms, styles, and motifs for visualizing the particular local groupness. From the great king's point of view, this process of strengthening the local cultural and political identity is part of the imperial definition, and therefore a consequence of an imperial integration process. I thank you very much.